Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the July 22nd, 2014 meeting of the Joint Commission on Public Ethics. I will start with comments on our minutes for our last public session, which was on June 24th, 2014. Comments? If there are no comments, I will entertain a motion to approve the minutes from June 24th.
So moved.
All in favor, say aye and raise your hand. Any opposed? Motion's carried. I'd like to now turn to our Executive Director, Leticia Tagliaferro, for an update on a number of items.
Thank you, Chairman. As part of our outreach efforts, we have been issuing ethics reminders from time to time to help the state workforce and to help the lobbyists comply with laws that are under our jurisdiction. We released one yesterday, so I wanted to just make everyone aware that it deals with post-employment restrictions. Specifically, it deals with the issue of when an agency hires back or contracts with a former state employee, that they should seek guidance from JCOPE. So that's up and on our website. I also want to give a quick update on a new training that we're developing. Our training unit has been working on an ethics training for lobbyists. That is being finalized and will be submitted to the statewide learning management system in the next few days. We anticipate that that training will be ready and we'll be rolling that out before the next commission meeting in August. Now I'd like to turn it over to our Director of Administration, Janine Clementi, for our first quarter financial report.
Thank you. For 2014-15, we have a cash allowance of $4.3 million. For the first quarter, April through the end of June, we have spent $740,376. That's approximately 17% of our cash for this fiscal year. First quarter usually lags a little bit behind with the end of the previous fiscal year and startup activities for the new fiscal year. Usually catches up to be more equal towards the middle of the fiscal year, around September.
Any questions?
Thank you, Janine. I'm going to turn to item 4 on our public agenda and ask our staff to first give us an update on the overhaul of lobbying guidelines. Leticia, please come on.
I can do that. After the meeting today, we'll be sending out an e-blast. Staff is undertaking a review of our lobbying guidelines, and we'll be soliciting comments from the regulated community and the general public. We'll send out an e-blast with a link to the current lobbying guidelines, but again, we'd like to have your comments, and that will be e-blasted later on today, and you can send those comments to us.
Great. And then I think there are some proposed amended public service announcement regulations,
yes,
which we want to address this morning.
The proposed public service announcement regulations are back before the Commission today for final approval. Generally, these proposed regulations provide guidance as to what constitutes a public service announcement, and they also create a blackout period for when a covered official, the 4 statewide elected officials, members of the legislature, can appear in a public service announcement. I'm going to turn it over to our Deputy Counsel, Monica Stam, at this point.
So, just to remind everybody where we are in the process with the public service announcement regs. These were part of a statutory mandate in Executive Law 94 for the Commission to address public service announcement regulations, and the staff and the Commission have been working on these regulations for well over a year. Last summer, we posted proposed or draft regulations on the Commission's website and sent them around by e-blast, seeking informal public comments on what we were considering doing with these regulations. After receiving those comments, We modified the proposed regulations. They were presented to the commission for the first time in the public session in or around October of last year, and there was a lot of discussion and comments, and the commission created a committee to work on these regulations. They were then presented back to the commission again in about February of last year, at which time the commission adopted them to go through the rulemaking process, and they were subsequently published in the state register, and we received formal public comments, and that is where they're now, and they're coming back to the commission after staff has reviewed those comments, and the comments are in your materials. The proposed regulations and the comments are in your materials at tab B. And based on the comments that we've received, staff is proposing some modifications to the regulations, none of which are material. They're just clarifications of some of the issues in the regulations. And again, they're for the Commission's consideration with those amendments. If there's any questions about the comments or the proposed changes, I'd be happy to answer those questions.
And the changes, Monica, are noted in blue or red line format in the materials in the book.
Exactly.
May
Yes, Marvin?
I, Chairman,
Yes.
may I ask one question? Monica, you said that these comments are not substantive, but I did notice one substantive comment, and it was the one that asked why our regs do not mirror those in the Federal Election Campaign Act of 30 and 60. We're up to 90. So I haven't seen an answer to that question. Why should our regulations on public service announcements different from those in the Federal Election Campaign Act?
Marvin, before I ask Monica to give you a substantive answer, I just want to make sure the record's clear. Monica said that the proposed changes which are in the book are not material. I don't believe she said the comments that we received.
Sorry about that.
On the regs are material.
A little difficult to hear here.
Yeah, no, I want to make sure the record's clear about that. So,
Apologize about
having made that clarification, Monica, I'm going to turn it over to you to address Marvin's question.
Okay, so just so everyone's aware, we're talking about the comments that were submitted by the Cable Telecommunications Association of New York, and they were just suggesting that we might want to consider different time periods. They specifically reference a citation to the Federal Election Campaign rules. Now, these regulations serve a very different purpose, and of course the Commission can consider changing the time period from 90 days to 60 days. But these particular regulations set forth the time period for what is an electioneering communication, and then if something is an electioneering communication, certain things need to be disclosed and certain additional rules need to be followed. We're obviously defining the inverse. We're defining a public service announcement regulation and then identifying a period in time on which a covered official cannot appear in a public service announcement regulation, but the rest of the time there isn't a problem with appearing in those. So the purposes are a little different. But there are also other relevant time periods there. My understanding is in the federal context, the House has and Sherry's right, they have a 90-day blackout period in the House. So the House has a 90-day blackout period on government mailings that feature government officials. And so that's one of the things that we look to when we propose the 90 days in the first place. But other entities have shorter time periods, and I think in the state it's possible that the Assembly has a 60-day blackout period for the government mailing, so for similar mailings. So, and in fact, I don't know, but I think some other entities might even have 30-day periods. So I think there are a lot of different time periods to choose from, and what's been in these regulations for well over a year has been 90 days. And we did reach out to the Cable Association, and my understanding is that they said it would not be a significant burden on them if we kept it at 90 days.
Can I just clarify that last point that you made, Monica? You said that the staff reached out to the Cable Telecommunications Association.
Yes.
Was that after the June 26th letter that we received from Allison Lee?
Right, we specifically reached out to Allison, well, to the Cable Association, I don't know if we spoke with Allison personally, but about these comments. But they've also previously had commented on these regulations and they never raised the time period before. Again, these have been subjected to informal comments, and so there's been other opportunities to comment on this time period.
What I'm saying.
I saw it also, and it would be nice if we all had the same time period.
And again, I mean, like I said, there are a lot of different time periods to choose from, but there are no other public service announcement regulations out there. They're all different. These are different types of rules for different types of purposes. They all relate to similar issues having to do with campaigns, but none of them are public service announcement regulations. So, you know, again, there are other time periods the commission could consider, but there's also a basis for 90 days.
I think the question that's being asked by the Cable Telecommunications Association is why we have gone to 90, and wouldn't it be easier, as Commissioner Roth suggests, if there was some symmetry to these time periods? They'd be more easily kept in mind. People do perhaps work on different levels at the same time, federal, state, whatever, and you're 90, they're 60. There may be different purposes. But what's the downside of carrying over the 60 to our regulations and having that time period apply?
So let me, Marvin, because I think you've asked the same question that Monica answered, and I'm not sure the answer is going to be any different. I think she's explained two things to you. First of all, there are different standards for different governmental bodies regarding the overall question of a time period. That's number one. Number two, the guidelines that you and Commissioner Roth and the Cable Association are referring to, at least in what the Cable Association put in its letter, which we received at the end of June, after these regulations have been under consideration for well over a year, and which representatives of the Cable Association apparently modified their position in their conversation that they had with our staff. It's apples and oranges in the sense that our regulations are for public service announcements. The regulations that you and Commissioner Roth and the Cable Association, at least in their letter of June 26th, mentioned don't concern public service announcements. So your comment that it would be good to be on the same schedule, really, I think in what Monica is explaining, is apples and oranges. I'd like to ask the staff a question with respect to procedurally. Can you inform us, what is the action item under consideration for us today? Because I think that's also a relevant consideration for the questions that Marvin, you, and Rini are raising.
Well, so what's before the commission would be amended regulations, but without a change to the time period, it's my view that these are not material changes and no further public comment period would be required. So if you adopt them as they are in the book, they would be finalized, and the question would be, do we, adopt them on an emergency basis so that they go into effect a little bit more quickly, so that they're clearly in effect for the coming election. If we were to make a change to the time period for the blackout period, in other words, if you were going to reduce the blackout period from 90 days to 60 days, I think that that would be a material change, and the regulations would need to go back out for further comment. And unless they're adopted on an emergency basis with that change, they would not be in effect for this coming election.
Wait, so that means that if we were to do what you were just suggesting, what you were outlining, then there would be no PSA regulations in effect for this coming election cycle.
Right.
Is that correct?
So there would be no blackout period at all for this coming election.
Okay.
Just one more question, Mr. Chairman.
Sure.
Do we have or know of any precedent for 90 days in other jurisdictions on the kinds of issues we're dealing with in this reg?
I'm just going to turn it over to Monica, but I heard her say at the beginning of her first answer to you that the United States House of Representatives has a 90-day time period, but I'll let her give you additional information.
That's exactly it. They have, the House has a blackout, it's my understanding they have a blackout period for franking, which I mean, my understanding is, so for government paid for mailings, they have a 90-day blackout on government paid for mailings featuring public officials. And so that's a similar concept to the PSA regs. And that's what we looked to when we came up with the 90-day period. I think there are some other things floating around with 90-day periods, possibly an IRS rule relating to 501c4s. But again, I mean, I want to be clear, there are other 60-day periods too. So my point is just this idea of having one consistent time period is not really a possibility. There are lots of various different time periods out there.
Thank you for your answer.
So I believe we need a motion then.
So, yeah, and again, one of the things I think the Commission needs to consider is whether to adopt the amended regulations on an emergency basis. If they're adopted on an emergency basis, they go into effect as soon as they are submitted to be published in the State Register, which means that we would hopefully be able to get them in before the 90-day blackout period would start for the coming election in November. If you don't adopt them on an emergency basis, they will become effective a few weeks later when they're published in the State Register, and it's a possibility then that the 90-day period will already have started. So again, it's my recommendation you adopt them on an emergency
basis. Does that mean we get to review it again?
You still cover primaries, or is that any election?
If you adopt the regulations as proposed,
Yeah.
then they could be finalized. This would be it. We would complete the rulemaking procedure because the proposed changes are not material. So there's no need for them to go out for another public comment period. If you make additional changes, it would depend on those changes.
And this affects primary elections also, doesn't it?
It does, but it will affect primary elections as well, but that we're already going to hit that 90-day period. I was more focusing on the general.
Right. So the motion that we are looking for is a motion to adopt as amended the public service announcements regulations on an emergency basis. So that they are.
Could I ask another question?
Can I just finish? Yes, you can. I just want to finish what the motion is.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So that they're in full force and effect for this election cycle. Yes, Paul.
It seems to me if they apply to primary elections also, that it impacts an official who is being primaried to a greater extent than it impacts an official who is not being primaried.
That's why there's a bunch.
You know, and I mean, you can, in a sense, maybe tie up by primarying somebody, you can tie up that official. And maybe we should think in terms of a shorter period of time, as suggested by the cable people, for the primary election cycle, as opposed to the general election cycle. I mean, in 90 days, we have a September primary, you'd be 90 days out from like September 5th. As opposed to 90 days out from November 5th, say the election was in November. And it seems to me that official is being primary. It gets, a little more restraint on them than the person who's not being primary.
Let me address that question. If there's a substantive additional response, I'll turn to Monica, Paul. But as you all know, because we've adopted regulations previously on an emergency basis, we are always free, once we put the regulations back in, to make changes to those regulations and go through the proper administrative processes for doing that. For what it's worth, it's my view that these regulations have been out for comment for a very, very long time. We have spent a lot of time working on these. This particular comment that we're discussing came in at the 11th minute of the 59th minute of the 11th hour from an organization that subsequently informed our staff that they would accept the 90-day rule. And so, given the fact that there is expectation in the community about the regulations as they've gone out, given the obvious need, in my view, to have public service announcements in place for this coming election cycle, and were we to defer action on this, there would be no regulations, so it would be my view that we should go forward with these regulations. And to the extent that commissioners continue to have questions about this particular issue, as we always can, once the regulations are in effect, we can go through a process to evaluate those regulations. So, unless there are other questions or comments.
Yes, I have a question. If we do something, if we take a vote or put some reg in place on an emergency basis, why does it have to be submitted for comment?
It doesn't. What I was saying, Judge Roth, was that we have ample precedent where we have adopted regulations either on an emergency or a permanent basis because, as we have here in my view, a need, justified public need to have a regulation as well as a statutory mandate to have a regulation. We put those regulations into effect, and then, as I said a minute ago, we're always free to have additional discussions to consider amendments to those. And my point, Judge Roth, is that if we don't adopt these regulations on an emergency basis, there will be no public service announcement regulations for the election cycle. And in my view...
Perhaps I did make my question clear enough, and I'll try to do better this time. When we adopt an emergency regulation, why do we have to submit it for public comment? What I'm saying is, why can't we change the 90 days to 60 days now on an emergency basis without having to solicit comment from the public?
Okay. So,
is that clearer?
Yes, Judge
It is,
Roth.
and I'm going to let Monica try to take a stab.
Okay, so Judge, so the change from 90 to 60 days would be a material change to the proposed regulations. So,
I understand
okay,
that.
so
Can we make changes, or can we do something on an emergency basis without soliciting public comment?
Yes, so let me just finish my answer, and I think this will answer your question. So we do need to seek public comment. We can adopt them on an emergency basis, so they will go into effect with the 60-day period, and submit them to public comment, and then we could finalize the regs after we go through another public comment period.
I assumed that was the case, so I so move that we reduce the 90 days to 60 days. 90 days seems to me to be inordinately long.
What is the...
So is the political season. Inordinately long, Your Honor, and I think that's part of the balance here.
So let me just understand, so you want to limit the time period from 60 to 90?
From 90 to
I'm sorry, 90 to 60. So there'd be a shorter period for those folks who are subject to the public service announcements. And who are they, Monica? That's anybody who's a public, elected public official who's seeking offices in this election cycle. You want to reduce that time period from 90 to 60. Is that what the motion is? I just want to understand.
Yes.
Right, so they would be allowed to appear in public service announcements up to 60 days before the general election.
Is there a second for that motion?
It's dead.
Are you withdrawing it?
Did Marvin second?
Is there, There's a motion, is there a second?
Commissioner Jacobs.
Marvin seconded it?
Thanks, yeah, I
Yes.
can't see, yeah.
Okay. All in favor of the motion, raise your hand and say aye.
Aye.
I love the minority.
Okay, finish.
All opposed, raise your hand and say nay. Nay.
Nay.
6,
The motion,
7.
can't make sure we get the count.
So how many is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Is Commissioner Renzi's hand up?
Free speech.
7, 8,
Yep.
right?
The motion does not carry. Is there a motion to adopt the regulations as proposed
So moved.
by the staff? Commissioner Weissman. Is there a second?
Second.
Commissioner Romeo. All in favor, raise your hand and say aye. Aye.
8. Commissioner Renzi.
Aye.
Paul voted.
Aye.
Marvin.
Marvin.
And Judge Roth? No. Okay. so-
Mosey's an aye.
It's okay.
She said okay.
She's
I
okay.
said unanimous.
Okay, so the motion carries unanimously.
And that is to, was that to also put it in emergency basis?
Yes,
Okay.
that's the motion.
All right, so these regs will become final
Right.
when they are published in the state register.
All right. Thank you for sturdy discussion. Unless there's any other matters, that concludes this portion of our public session today, and I'll entertain a motion to enter into executive session pursuant to Executive Law, Section 94-19B, to take up matters that are confidential. When we complete that executive session, we will return to the public session and report on what we've done in the executive session as permitted by law. I will take a motion now to enter into executive session.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, raise your hand and say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Seeing none, the motion is carried. Thank you, members of the public. We'll now enter into executive session, and we'll return when we complete our executive session work. All right, we're back in the public session. We're going to report on our actions in the executive session. In the course of discussion of litigation issues around the source of funding exemption appeals of 4 groups, the Commission resolved to grant 2-year period of exemptions for these groups, and they will not be required to reapply until July 15th, 2015. The motion to grant this 2-year period was made by Commissioner Roth, seconded by Commissioner Castellero, and was carried by a unanimous vote of the Commission. In addition to that matter, the Commission, during its executive session, discussed several investigative matters, approved the settlement agreement, and approved an application for an exemption to the 2-year bar pursuant to Public Officers Law, Section 73, subsection 8-B. Unless there is any other business before the Commission, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor,
Aye.
say aye.
Aye.
The motion carries unanimously. Thank you, and we'll see you on August 12th.